Welcome back. I hope you had a good break. We're going to now look at some examples of where speciation has taken place, and we're going to have a look at how we track these, or how we determine, or how we see how speciation has occurred looking at a cladogram. Okay, so let's have a look here on the board. So we've completed geographic speciation. So there we had a look at how it actually occurs due to a speciation event, a physical barrier, and then we're going to have a look at how the speciation actually occurs, and we're going to look at the cladogram, and we're going to look at the speciation events, and then what speciation and extinction has, the effect it has on biodiversity. All right, so let's have a look at the first slide. Okay, so this is what we call a cladogram, and as I said earlier, a cladogram is an evolutionary diagram, and what it basically does is it shows the relationship between different organisms. So it's an evolutionary diagram, and it shows relationships between organisms. Okay, so let's have a look at the diagram here. So this is what we call a clad, and we can either draw it like this, where the lines come off at an angle. We can draw it like that, or we can actually have it where we have straight lines and we show how the species then develop like that. All right, so basically on a cladogram or a phylogenetic tree, which is a little bit of a larger diagram than that, it's very clear where speciation events occurred and where species split into two. Now, in the previous section, we had a look at what causes the population to split into two, and now we're going to have a look at where we can see this on an evolutionary diagram. So here, where we see this, here's a species, and they are developing, and this is through time. So this is basically time here. And as we see them developing, we see that there's a group that branches off the main branch. And then time goes on some more, and then we see another branch that branches off. And so time goes by. And when we have a look at the top here, we see we now have 3 different species. Okay, and we can see how they developed. So they would have come from a common ancestor or a common parent group. And that is now, they have now developed into they've developed into 3 different species. The same here. Here we have a common ancestor, and what happened is there was some kind of environmental occurrence over here, and that environmental occurrence caused them to split, and that population split into 2, and there we see then they stayed 2 populations for a period of time, and then there was another speciation event that took place here. Once again, the environmental conditions changed, and they then split into 2 species, whereas this species just continued as is. Okay, so if we have a look at the top again, we can see that we started off with 1 population, and we now have 3 different species. All right, so over time, if the species remain alive, they are extant, and extant means that they're still in existence. Okay, so we can see all of these species, they're still alive here at the end, so that they've still reached, say if this would be present time, they would still all be in existence. So that is what we say they are extant. Whereas if, say for example, this species, the branch only goes up to here, and they don't reach the current time, then we would say they have become extinct. So they have died out. All right, if the lineage line does not reach the top of the tree, then the species became extinct. Okay. All right, now we need to have a look at what effect do speciation and extinction events have on biodiversity. Okay, so let's have a look at all of those terms. So first of all, speciation. So when we talk about speciation, we're talking about more species developing or species being formed. So we have more species formed. Okay, for whatever reason, due to a speciation event. And then if we have a look at the term extinction, and we just said that now, if a population or a species dies out, they then become extinct. So they die out. All right. So if we have a look at those two, then we can see speciation would then increase the numbers of species that we find. So that would increase the species, whereas an extinction event would decrease. So we have fewer species then, and so that decreases the number of species. So what effect would these two have then on the biodiversity that we find on Earth? Okay, so speciation events, as I said, they would increase the number of species, therefore speciation increases biodiversity. So we find that there's so many more, with many speciation events, we find that there would be an emergence of many species. For example, if we have a look at the Galapagos Islands, and we have a look at the finch species. They started off with one common or one ancestor species, so there was one species of finch, and today when we have investigators or scientists have studied the number of species on the Galapagos Islands, they see that there are now between 13 and 17 different species of finch. So, and this is because what happened is when they arrived, or when they, there was a speciation event. So either they were geographically isolated, so the group was split on different islands, and when they arrived in those habitats, they found that there wasn't much competition, and there was lots of available food, and so they were able to speciate and become so many more species. All right, and then if we have a look at extinction events. All right, and extinction events are those kind of things, and we speculate, and scientists have looked through the ages and have looked at the fossil record and have looked at different aspects of the environment, and they have seen that there were times when we had mass extinctions for whatever reason. So it could have been an asteroid that hit the Earth and destroyed a large area, or it could have been a volcano, or an earthquake, or whatever, or continental drift, and that changed the environmental conditions. And then many species died out. So what we have then, so it results in the loss of some species, and therefore it causes a decrease in biodiversity. All right, so here's a nice example. They are lovely trees, and the baobab tree is one of South Africa's famous trees, if you like. We have many of them, and they actually become very old trees. They become very large and very old. So if you have a look at the diagrams here, so here we have an example of the South African baobab. You can see a lot of people call it the upside down tree because it looks like these are all the roots at the top here of the tree. And these trees can actually become very old, and they become the diameter of the the stem actually becomes very large. Okay, so that's an example that we find in South Africa. Now, there's another example that we find in Australia, and this is what this one looks like. So you can see, you know, it's quite different to this one, or it's quite a bit different. So you can see the stem is quite different, and the branches and the leaves make it look slightly different, although it is still quite a tree that, you know, spreads out. So, and that's the Australian example. Then we have a look over here at the third diagram, and here we can see these are also baobab trees, but they are found in Madagascar. And they are very different to the others in that they grow extremely tall. Over here you can see there's people walking there, so these trees actually become very, very, very big. And they you know, they look quite different. But however, if we have a look at the three, so if we have a look at the Madagascar baobab and we look at the South African baobab, we can see that there's quite a bit of difference between the two. But if we have a look at the Australian one, it seems to have you know, characteristics that kind of tie the two together. So if we look at the stem of the Australian one, it looks similar to the stem, you know, that smooth kind of stem of the Madagascan one. However, the branches and the way in which they branch out of the Australian one is more similar to the South African one in which it branches out. So we can see that they do have characteristics that are similar. So what this would indicate for us is that these species, or the speciation, has occurred due to some kind of geographical barrier. And in this case, we know all of these. South Africa is on the continent of Africa. Australia, obviously, it's its own continent. Madagascar is an island off the East African coast. So what it shows us is that due to a physical barrier, so the physical barrier split the ancestral population. Okay, so the physical barrier now would be the oceans that we find between the continents. And what has happened is each of these groups or populations in their new environment underwent natural selection in response to the specific environmental conditions that they found themselves in. And because of that, we now have 3 different species of baobab tree. All right, here's another example. If we have a look, and we had a look at this when we did biogeography, but here we can see the large birds. They are flightless birds, and we find them on different continents. And once again, they are separated by vast areas of ocean and water bodies. So although they look similar, they are different species, and that is because they were separated by a physical barrier, underwent natural selection separately, and then have evolved or developed into new species. All right, another example of speciation due to continental drift is also the organisms or the animals that we call anteaters, or we call them pangolins or armadillos. And if we have a look here, we can see, so there's the giant armadillo on the North American continent, the giant anteater on the South American continent, the giant pangolin we find in Africa, and then the spiny anteater we found in Australia and New Zealand. So if we have a look at them, we can see that they look, you know, like they have similar characteristics. So if we have a look at each of them, we can see that more than likely they came from a common ancestor, and that population as well, the ancestor was split into 2 or 3 or 4, however many groups, by continental drift, and they then developed into different species. Okay, so just to sum up, we've had a look now at the cladogram of speciation. We've had a look at the effect that speciation and extinction has on biodiversity. And then we've had a look at specific examples of speciation due to continental drift where different species were formed. Can't remember. Okay, so we're going to stop there for now, and we're going to take a short break, and we'll see you back afterwards.
Thank you.